This episode is dedicated to the Lighthouse, an initiative partnered by the NSPCC. Did you know that 1 in 20 children in the UK are sexually abused, and 1/3 of those will never tell, even into adulthood? The Lighthouse is a centre in Camden in London that is a one-stop shop for sexually abused children. Historically, children have been dragged around medical practitioners, the police and social services, having to tell their story time and again and rehash their trauma. In this centre, all the services come to the child. Here they can testify on camera rather than appearing in court, and at the Lighthouse, therapy is also on hand. The Rebuilding Childhoods Board, chaired by my guest David Tate, is one of 4 boards that partners with the NSPCC, and they raise money and awareness for the Lighthouse and other projects. David's aim is for there to be 30 such centres around the UK. Currently, there is only 1. To find out more or to donate, go to www.nspcc.org.uk and look at the show notes for more details. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of artists, performers and rock stars of life. There's something wonderful about the friends you make at school, college or university, basically the friends you make when you were young. Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that you have yet to make anything of yourself, so there's been no time to start feeling pleased with yourself. Perhaps it's because it's a time in your life when you have time, and paired with that, little responsibility so you can be endlessly silly. Whatever the reason, there is something there that means that if years or even decades pass, when you meet that person again, that silliness returns, that friendship, affection roars back, and the years roll back, and you're back in your youth with your treasured friend, and it feels like no time has passed at all. And in that moment, you're young again. It's rather wonderful. We had a graduation ceremony at New College, Oxford this year for all the people in our year who weren't organised enough to graduate when they should have. 30 years later, we graduated, and it was such a special day for precisely those reasons. And it was there that I re-met my wonderful friend of old and my guest today. So who is he? He is a British and American political commentator. He was David Cameron's Director of Strategy when he was Prime Minister. He's an entrepreneur, an author, a podcaster, and he hosts his own television show. With all his political experience, he looks set to be the Republican candidate for governor of the state of California in 2026. Having made his mark on both sides of the Atlantic, I'm looking forward to hearing about how he went from the son of Hungarian immigrants living in a basement flat to becoming David Cameron's Director of Strategy, to becoming the Republican hopeful for Governor of California, following in the footsteps of the likes of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Ronald Reagan. It is a story that spans different occupations, nationalities, countries, and continents. What joy that I get to talk today to my old friend, Steve Hilton. Hello, Steve. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm really happy to be here. I'm kind of exhausted after listening to all that. Amazing. Thank you so much. That's very kind. I do need to put in a very big caveat right at the top, if that's okay, which is that you're quite correct. I am going to be seriously looking at running for governor of California. That is true, as a Republican, but no decision's been made yet. So we'll have to wait and see. We're going to get this year's elections out of the way first. The election for governor is 2026, so we're a little bit away from that. But pretty much everything else was spot on. And the thing I most want to agree with you about is how special that day was when we were together.
It was, wasn't it?
And do you know what I really remember? You nailed it. Everything you said was so correct about why it mattered and so on. But for me, the most stunning thing about it was how instant it was. It was incredible. I just remember it so clearly. We arrived at New College. I was with my son now, who's 16.
Yeah.
And we were meeting my mom and my stepdad, and they were already there. So we were all kind of meeting up. And I was rushing, I was late, and I had to wear a suit, which I never do, and a kind of bow tie and all this stuff. It was kind of hot, actually. And I was hot, and I thought, I can't go in there all sweaty and hot. So I was waiting outside a little bit, and I could hear everyone inside in this room. I can't remember what it's called, the Undercroft or something like that.
Yeah, the Undercroft.
Where we all were meeting in order to put our gear on and get ready for the ceremony. And so I was waiting, and I heard everyone in there, and I was probably one of the last to arrive. So I walk in the room, and suddenly you see everyone, including you and all our friends, and it was just instant, this connection and this, like you said, the rollback of time. And it was totally amazing to me. And we're suddenly all there with some of us. I mean, we haven't seen each other for, 30 odd years or whatever.
Yeah.
Just hugging and joking around. And it was absolutely amazing. I honestly don't think I've ever had an experience like it.
No, I agree. It was instant. and just joyous. Nothing had changed.
Exactly right.
Normally, I start off with guests' upbringing, but in fact, for you, I'd love to go a little bit further back. And I'd like to talk a little bit about your parents. Why did they choose to claim asylum in the UK?
There's a three-part story to that because both my parents are Hungarian and also my stepfather, who's also Hungarian. And in fact, I really grew up with him as my father because my parents got divorced when I was pretty young. I think two or three, something like that. I don't remember. But really, as long as I can remember, I was with my mum and my stepfather. So it's like three of them, all Hungarian, all had a slightly different pathway. So my father was quite a bit older than my mother. And he had been quite well known in Hungary because he was a famous sports guy. He was actually the goalkeeper for the Hungarian national ice hockey team, which was pretty successful at that time.
Yeah.
So he's pretty well known, and it's a small country. So when you have a team that does well, the players are really a big deal. And so he was pretty well known, and he was an anti-communist. And so when the Soviet invasion in 1956, and he'd been quite outspoken. By that time, he'd retired from sport. I think he owned a paint factory. I remember him telling me something like that. He was like a business guy. And they took that. I remember he had this thing about they took my paint factory. He died when I was pretty young. So I'm just remembering vaguely stories. So he was pretty outspoken about communism and defected, actually, because he was quite high profile. That's the right word to use. I think he said he was on tour coaching a team or something like that and found an embassy and just announced that he was leaving, and then ended up in Australia with his first wife. And then from Australia went to the UK, where he met my mother. They were both working at Heathrow Airport in the restaurant, the cafe at Heathrow Airport, in the kitchen. And she had come, like I said, she was much younger. And this is now the mid-60s or something like that. I don't really know the exact details, but she had a different story because she was learning English in university in Hungary and somehow managed to get a 3-month study trip to England, something like that. And then while she was there, I think, I don't know whether she met my dad or whatever, but she decided to stay. And again, I don't know the exact details of how that worked out. I haven't really talked to them about it, but then they got together in England. And then I was born 1969. And then they split up, as I say. And then my mum got together with my stepfather, who's also Hungarian. And he had the most dramatic story because he grew up in a village in the western side of Hungary. And he has this amazing story. So, in other words, quite close to the border with Austria. And he tells this story about he was 14 years old and he and his brother and some friends from school heard on the radio. I remember him saying they heard the phrase, "the Russians are coming." This is going back to 1956 again, the Soviet invasion. The Russians are coming. So they all decided to just leave as kids. It's amazing now to think about that. I mean, my son is 16. So this is like my youngest is 13. So it's just an amazing thing to imagine. But they literally ran for the border to escape from the Russians who were coming, as they heard on the radio. And they literally climbed barbed wire fences and went through minefields and the border, a fortified Eastern Bloc border. And some of them were killed trying to do it. And my stepfather and his brother made it, and they ended up in a refugee camp in Austria. And then the most amazing bit of this whole story, which is really jumping ahead, but you mentioned his name already, Arnold Schwarzenegger. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, before he was a massive movie star and governor of California and so on, he's Austrian. And he's from the eastern part of Austria, near the Hungarian border. And one time we were having dinner a while back. We'll get to how I got to know him later. We were just chatting about all of this. And he said he remembers as a kid, his father taking him on their bikes. They had the Hungarian refugee camp was near where they lived, near their town, Graz. And his father took him to volunteer in the Hungarian refugee camp. He said, I went there as a kid. I used to go on my bike. I used to help out. We used to serve them meals, all this kind of stuff.
They could have knocked into each other.
Right, exactly. So there's this weird possibility that literally Arnold served him a meal when he was in the refugee camp. So that's my stepfather. And then he ended up through a resettlement program being sent to England, Yorkshire, Northern England. I think he said he lived on a former RAF base for a while or whatever. He ended up learning the building trade, I guess, because that's the kind of thing you do if you're a refugee, and did pretty well and ended up running a little small building contractor. And so that's how I grew up with him and my mom in Brighton in Sussex. And When I was a kid, I used to go and help out on the building site and all that kind of stuff. So that's their story. So all slightly different.
You were awarded a bursary at Christ Hospital School, and I read its mission statement. Christ Hospital is widely known in the UK for its outstanding education principle and its diverse breadth of students. It is the mission of Christ Hospital to continue to enable those from all corners of society to come together and thrive regardless of their background. So most of us have a sliding doors moment. Was being accepted to Christ Hospital yours, do you think?
Yeah, I do think that's right. What happened was that going to that school put me on a trajectory which ended up going to Oxford, where we met. And then that in turn catapults you into the elite. I now rage against the elite. Obviously, I'm now part of the elite, as I openly acknowledge, but that wasn't where I started out. I always remember where I started out. And I do think that's right. Christ Hospital is an amazing school, actually, because I know this is, I think, currently a live debate in the UK, the charitable status of public schools.
Yes.
Christ Hospital really is a charity, genuinely, in the sense that it basically has all the trappings of a famous public school. It's a charitable foundation. And there's a means test, and there's different routes into it. It originally was founded in the City of London, right opposite the Tower of London. Actually, you can see the original location. And it's old, it's 1553, and it was, as the name suggests, Christ's Hospital. It was set up as a hospital for poor, sick kids on the streets of London. And then they started giving them an education, and that's how it became a school. And then only in the early 1900s, I think, moved to this campus in Sussex, this beautiful rural campus. It's an amazing, amazing school because it really is a way for people from underprivileged backgrounds to get an amazing education. I mean, I remember when I worked on policy back in the day in the Conservative Party, then in Number 10, I really was interested in whether we could create more institutions like that. It's such a great model, and maybe inspire some present day philanthropists to set something up like that.
You go on to New College to read PPE, and your PPE tutorial partner is our mutual friend, my roommate, the one and only fabulous in every way, Helen Sherborne, and I know she's going to be listening to this. Why New College?
Well, you skipped out a very important step, actually. I always look back on it and say it's the most important job I ever had, which is what I did in my gap year. So I was very young. At Christ Hospital, they put me up for 3 years, I think, education.
They put you up 3 years.
Yeah.
So you were 15 when you left.
Basically, my birthday's in August. So yeah, I was very young for everything. I remember going to the interviews for university, actually. I can't remember one of them. I remember the interviewer. We were just chatting, and she looked down at my form, and we're having the conversation. She goes, "Oh," I remember the way she said it really loudly. "Oh, you're a baby. You must take a year." Whatever. I thought, yeah, I am planning to take a year off. Anyway, so I had a gap year, but we didn't have any money, so I didn't do traveling or whatever. I worked, and I found this amazing job. I literally found an ad for it in the newspaper, the national newspaper, the Times, or I don't know what it was. It was an intern job, a construction company in the City of London. It was amazing. It was called Ashby and Horner. I don't know if it's still going. And it was just around the time of the deregulation of the City of London. They called it the Big Bang. And so there's this massive boom in the city. And this was a very old construction company going back hundreds of years that built a lot of the buildings in the City of London. They'd established a specialty in installing dealing rooms and converting to the new high-tech financial thing that everyone was going for. And so they got all this new business, and they just didn't have enough people. And so halfway through the year, or at some point during the year, they said, "Look, could you be a project manager?" I said, "Yeah, whatever." And so I ended up getting this incredible opportunity. I must have been 16 or something.
And do people listen to you?
This is the amazing thing. I actually talk about this to this day. I'm on the road a lot in California, getting involved in all sorts of policy discussions, meeting business people of all kinds. And we're with construction people the other day. So can you believe it? I was literally showing up on these construction sites as a kid, 16-year-old kid, with my sort of clipboard and my Gantt charts and all these things. And there's all blokes in those days.
Yes.
And it was like, who's this kid? Checking up on whether we've done the bricklaying in the right order and where's the electrical stuff and all that. And it was just an incredible job because you have to learn to get on with everybody and somehow keep the show on the road. It was a really amazing training. So that was before New College.
Going back to New College, how did you enjoy it?
Well, I loved it to start with. I really did. Because of meeting you and Helen and everyone. It was so fun. And our mutual friend Paz and Somin and Dan, all the people there at that day. And it was just fantastic. I really loved it. And I had a lot of fun. And it was just really cool. I loved everything about it. But if we're looking at the whole 3 years, by the end, I do remember feeling really frustrated with it. And especially by the time we got to final, like the last 6 months, I think I really hated, to be perfectly honest. I was never particularly academic. I'm not stupid,
Clearly, if you're 3 years ahead.
but I'm not an intellectual. I got a 2-1, which is good. Most people get a 2-1, I think. But I never was in the category to get a first. That was not my thing. And I didn't really study hard enough because I found academic study, I didn't really get into. I remember so clearly before finals. I don't know if people still do it like this, where you have finals. It's certainly not like this in America, but where it's all the exams at the end. Is that still the way it goes?
Yeah, I do remember you had a very unorthodox method of studying.
No, exactly. Well, you remember that. So I got to the January of the finals. You think, I don't know anything. I don't remember anything. How am I going to pass these exams? I thought, well, if I stay up at Oxford in the Easter holidays before the finals term without any distractions, no one's around, we're not going out, we're not doing anything fun, then I'll just get my head down and I'll learn everything. And I just remember it so clearly. It was such a disaster. I found I couldn't do it. I'd literally go to the library and I'd try and read these books and I'd literally fall asleep with my head on the book. Often that happened. I'm not learning. This is a disaster. I get to the start of the actual term and finals are like halfway through the term, but certainly for PP. And I remember thinking, I don't know what to do.
I still have nightmares. 30 years later, I have nightmares about taking my exams.
Right. And so the thing that I ended up thinking was, well, I'm clearly not learning this way. I'm not remembering anything. What about lectures? And lectures were never mandatory. So I never went to it. I went to like a handful in the whole of the 3 years, literally a handful. And then I thought, well, maybe that'll work. And I went to a couple of lectures. I thought, this is brilliant. I'm learning. And I would write. And I really took in the information. And it's so ridiculous that I only discovered that at the end. And the fact that they don't make you, I mean, it's just embarrassing. But I spent almost 9 to 5 going to lectures, because if it was school, that final term. And that's how I seemed to gather enough information to get through it.
Am I right in saying that when you left New College, you went straight to Conservative Central Office?
Yes.
And what was the attraction to do it straight away?
So I remember a conversation with a guy called Ed Llewellyn,
Yes, I remember him.
who was a year or two above us. And he was studying, I guess, modern languages, where you go. He was away for a year. That was when the Berlin Wall came down and all the regime change was happening in Eastern Europe. So 1989. I really remember this conversation. It's in the bar at New College. And I was talking to him, and I hadn't met him before because he'd been away for a year through his modern languages thing. And we got chatting, and he was really interested in what was going on in Eastern Europe and politics generally and foreign policy. And I found out that what he was doing after he graduated was going to work at the Conservative Party, Conservative Central Office. No, that's not quite right. Here's what happened. I remember it so clearly now, which was, and I remember the guy, he was the chairman of the Conservative Party at the time, he was called Peter Brook. I remember the name because he was very sort of stuffy, classic old-fashioned Tory guy. I subsequently met his son, and got to know him pretty well. Anyway, Peter Brook was the chairman, and he did one of those party political broadcasts. And at the end of it, I remember in his posh voice said, "If we want to support the Conservative Party, write to me, Peter Brook." And I thought, well, maybe they have some jobs. I haven't talked about this for years. This is right. This is the timeline. Do you remember there was that big storm in the south of England?
Yes, I do remember.
And there was a famous weather guy who said, don't worry, there's no hurricane or whatever. And they turned out to be a hurricane. There's massive destruction. Anyway, in Brighton, I remember one of my holidays, getting a job from a temping agency at Eagle Star Insurance. I don't know if it still exists. Eagle Star Insurance, I remember the office. It was so boring. Basically, they were overwhelmed by claims because of the storm mainly hit the south of England. And so they were sending claims from around Brighton to their other offices to be processed. And this was before the internet, before email, whatever. And literally my job for like 4 weeks was taking a paper file of the claim form and whatever, and stapling it together and putting it in. It was going to Edinburgh. I spent all day literally putting it in boxes and stapling E for Edinburgh
Yeah.
for 4 weeks doing that. And I remember thinking at the end of it, I can't do this anymore. It's just so boring. There must be better jobs than this. Then I watched this party political broadcast, and this guy said, write to me. And I thought, okay, well, maybe they have jobs. I was always interested in politics. I found it interesting. I was following it. Obviously, I did PPE.
You
That
did
was
it.
what I chose to do. So I was interested in politics. And I literally wrote them a letter saying, I'm a student at Oxford. I'm doing PPE. Do you have any summer jobs? This is before I had the conversation with Ed Llewellyn. And they said, actually, yes, come and have an interview. So I went and had an interview, and I got a job as a summer intern. And that was the summer before I left Oxford. Then I met Ed Llewellyn, and he'd already got a job there. That's, I think, why we got talking. And he said, no, I'm working there full time. It's a really great opportunity. You should do it too. So that's how that all came about. And then I wrote back to them and said, look, do you have any openings for permanent positions? And I went for another interview, and that's how that happened.
From Conservative Central Office, you then were seconded to Saatchi and Saatchi for the election campaign. You joined Saatchi's and went to Hong Kong to set up M&C Saatchi. Morris Saatchi said of you, no one reminds me as much of me when young as Steve. What was it about the advertising industry that then successfully diverted you away from politics, having gone straight into it?
We left 1990. So I started the summer of 1990. Mrs. Thatcher was still the Prime Minister. And for the first year or so, my job was trade and industry and energy desk officer, where you're doing research on those policy areas, but you're getting really amazing experience. At one point, I had to write the first draft of a party conference speech for a cabinet minister. Amazing stuff at that age, which you just don't get that kind of experience doing anything else. And I always joke about it to my friends here in American politics. It's basically because British politics is all on such a shoestring. There's no money. There's hardly any people, and everyone's. So it's actually great for if you've got energy and enthusiasm and are willing to work hard, you get great opportunities. It's unimaginable here because it's kind of big business, really, politics. And the Saatchi thing was amazing because the job was to be the go-between. For example, if they wanted to do ads, fact checking and giving them information and helping them think about the arguments and so on. But it became much more than that because with a guy called Andrew Lansley, who was then the head of the research department, went on to be a member of parliament and cabinet minister, we worked very closely on something that was really it never really been done before, but a kind of pre-election campaign, which was in 1992, really, in my view, and a lot of observers' view, the time during which we really won that election that no one expected John Major to win in 1992. And so it was way beyond just the advertising. And I found myself kind of planning. I was called campaign coordinator, and I was the guy who was running around all the different bits of the machinery and the cabinet ministers and the special advisors and the researchers and the ad agency, whatever, saying, okay, here's the plan. This is what we're going to be talking about this week. We'll release a policy document. We'll release a new ad. We'll have a speech from the Prime Minister on this or that. It was a planning job, really. And it was, again, a really incredible opportunity. But through that, I just got on really well with Morris and Charles Saatchi and the team. And then it was still Saatchi and Saatchi. They were just fun, just interesting. They're amazing people. And at that time, Saatchi and Saatchi was a massive global company. They owned hundreds of agencies all around the world. But because in this case, and they don't normally get involved so directly in an account and with the client, but when the client's the Prime Minister, obviously they're very involved. And they found it interesting too. So I had a level of exposure to them that was very unusual. In a sense, I was on the client side and very junior. So it was an incredible opportunity. And just we got on really well. And they offered me a job straight afterwards. And it was a two-pronged role. So I was assigned to commercial advertising accounts like British Airways, for example, but also they wanted to capitalize on the fact that they'd now helped the British Conservatives get elected 4 times in a row. And so that became quite a well-known thing around the world. And so they wanted to, in partnership with the local Saatchi agencies in various countries, see if they could develop a election campaigns practice. And so that was the idea. They set up this thing grandly called Saatchi and Saatchi Government Communications Worldwide, which was basically me. I was still just very like 25 or something. I did an election campaign in Ireland, and we did a bunch of countries in Europe. We did one in Colombia. Boris Yeltsin, we helped a little bit in Russia when they had their first free election. So it was a really amazing time.
Yeah, super exciting. And then one of your endeavors, you were early in developing a series of companies that were built around the theme of good governance. I'm probably hopping around a bit now. And in many ways, that was a forerunner to what's known now as ESG. Why did that grab your attention?
So what happened was that while I was at Saatchi and Saatchi, actually, before the split with M&C Saatchi, by the way, just the narrative there is that halfway through my time there, Saatchi and Saatchi was a public company, and they had a hostile investor who was arguing that they were wasting money and could do better. So they had a classic investor attack, and they were kicked out. Charles and Morris, the founders of the company, were kicked out.
I remember.
Voted off the board. It was a big story. And so they said, well, we're starting our own new company. Initially, it was called the New Saatchi Agency. And then they changed it to M&C, Morris and Charles Saatchi. And I went with them, obviously, because I knew them, the close team, and started an agency from scratch. And that's why I was in Hong Kong for a year, because, in fact, we won the British Airways account from what we called the old Saatchi. So they wanted people that they knew running the account in the key markets, and one of them was Hong Kong. So they sent me to Hong Kong to help there. So I was in Hong Kong for a year, which is also an amazing experience. But while the Saatchi and Saatchi was still there and I was working there, as well as doing the political stuff, I was also the person that if anything slightly weird or unusual came in, it would go to me. For example, I got involved in the lottery, the national lottery, and bidding for that, which was really Camelot, all of that. And another example of that was, this was really unusual, which was, it was a documentary being made for Channel 4. It was a kind of fly on the wall documentary for the Commission for Racial Equality. And they had this idea of inviting 3 or 4 London ad agencies to pitch for their account to do an anti-racism campaign. And they didn't really have the budget to do a campaign, but it's an exercise and they wanted to see what ideas were out there and it would be interesting for the documentary. So they went through this process and they chose us as one of the shortlist. And so I was the person that went along to take the meeting and so on. And so we were part of this documentary. And then we, for real, put together a campaign and pitched to them and so on. And we won the pitch, as it were, even though there wasn't really a campaign. But then we all got together and said, forget about the documentary. This is actually a really great campaign. We should try and do it. It's really good. And so they said, yeah, well, we don't really have a budget for this. I remember saying with a guy who then went on to be my business partner at Good Business, we said, well, why don't we try and raise the money either directly or through in-kind contributions, whatever, from some of our clients, and maybe they'll want to be associated with advancing a good cause such as anti-racism and so on. So we had this whole idea of getting brands involved. And we made it happen, and it did happen. And we launched this campaign. It was very good, actually. Still, we won lots of awards, and it was a great campaign. I'm very proud of it. Anyway, through that whole process, I guess we talked a lot about the potential role of business and brands in particular at changing attitudes. And it particularly focused on brands at that point, not what's now known as ESG or corporate responsibility more broadly. We started off with a very specific idea, which is that a lot of the problems that governments try and address, they're actually questions of behavior and attitude, racism being a great example. And of course, you have anti-discrimination legislation, but in the end, if you're trying to change the way people think, that's a deeper thing. And brands are very good at that. So if you look at some of these questions like, how do you persuade people to, I don't know, anything, eat healthily or not drop litter or whatever, there's a whole range of things which are about behavior. And so we developed this theory that actually brands could be very good at that, much more effective than government, actually, because brands have a lot of trust with people. So that became this whole theory. Giles and I, my business partner, then went on to say, well, why don't we do that? Why don't we actually try and create a company that does just that? And that was the origin of Good Business.
Under your Good Business umbrella, you started the award-winning restaurant, The Good Cook. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I love that you said award-winning, because in many ways that was the greatest success. Financially, I have to say it was a bit of a disaster, which anyone who's been in the restaurant business can tell you is entirely predictable. Yeah. But the thing that was really interesting about that whole experience was that it just taught you how hard it is to run, if you like, a real business. If you think about some of the other things that I've done, the consulting firm, or later on, we'll talk about the software company, the tech company I started in California. A restaurant is right at the other end of the spectrum. It's like a real business. It's tough. You've got human aspects to it. You've got the food, you've got the service, you've got all these different costs and complexities, and it's just very difficult. But the reason that we did it was that my business partner and I always had this idea that we wanted to run not just a consulting firm where we would advise other companies on their business, but we would love to have our own business that would exemplify what we meant by good business in terms of social values and environmental sustainability, all those kinds of things. So that was the idea. It was kind of opportunistic in the sense that we heard about an organization that had refurbished an amazing venue in Notting Hill into a community center, and they wanted someone to operate a really great restaurant there. We thought that was perfect because it's already got a social component to it, and it's in the community in a very mixed area in Notting Hill. You got the Caribbean, you got the carnival and so on. It was just very much part of all of that. So we thought that's fantastic. And we put it all together, and it was just one of those things. We were young and wanted to make something happen that felt very implausible. We'd never done anything like that before. But bit by bit, we put all that together. Through a friend of a friend, we found Allegra McEvedy, who's an amazing chef, that agreed to be our first chef. It was just a real adventure, actually. But what we produced was an amazing restaurant. It really was. And it combined some of the things that we wanted. Great food at affordable prices. So it wasn't just for fancy Notting Hill people. We had an opportunity for now regular people to come and enjoy what was available. And we had a job training program for local disadvantaged young people so that they could learn skills. And we had a whole set of things that we layered on, which again made it incredibly difficult to make money. But it was really, really rewarding. And actually, we did get recognized. And my favorite thing in a way was there's a thing with restaurants where you let reviewers know that you're ready now and you can come and review it. And we had someone come in and review it before that moment, just someone who lived in the area, a guy called James Dellingpole, who I subsequently got to know and became pretty friendly with. Anyway, it was very chaotic, but he lived nearby and he just came in and then wrote to us up. And I think it was in the Independent. The first sentence was brilliant. I remember it. If revenge is a dish best served cold, as a restaurant reviewer, I should now be in seventh heaven because I have just eaten at a restaurant so comically inept it makes faulty towers look like the Manuaro Cat Saison. So that's a brilliant line. And it was chaotic when he came in. But subsequently, we did much better and got some awards and so on. But it was a great experience. But I don't recommend trying to run a restaurant as well as running another business. You've really got to be there the whole time.
Yeah, I do remember it. Delicious food. Back to government. You met David Cameron when you were at Central Office. Can you tell us how you went from that first interaction to being appointed his director of strategy at Number 10?
I'm just trying to recall the sequence. So it was after the general election where Michael Howard lost to Tony Blair. So I'm guessing that's 2005. Michael Howard stepped down as leader of the Conservative Party. I was running good business and we're doing very well there. But obviously we're friends, we'd kept in touch. And so the question was, would David Cameron run for the leadership? There's a vacancy for the leadership. Michael Howard has stepped down, and there's rumors and speculation about the different people that were going to run. David Davis was one of them. There's a whole bunch. Liam Fox, I can't remember all the names. And Dave said that he wanted to do it. And we remember we sitting and talking it through. And he said, yeah, I'm going to go for it. And he said, will you help me? And I said, of course I'll help you. And so we just talked all that through. And he did his campaign, and I actually took 3 months off or whatever it was. I think the campaign started in the summer of 2005, and the actual election, which was among the party members, was in December, I think. Along the way, there was a really big moment. You had a few big moments, in particular, the Conservative Party conference that year, where all the candidates were on stage and so on. So we did that together, and he won. And at that point, it was just a really interesting decision for me because we hadn't discussed what would happen after that. And he had assumed, I think, that I would stay on and work with him, but we really hadn't talked about it. And I had this company, and it was a bit of a dilemma. And I remember having the conversation with him. And at first I said, well, I can't. I mean, I've got this business. And he looked really kind of crestfallen and sad and hurt, actually. And I took that very seriously. And then I talked to my business partner. I said, look, this is a really amazing opportunity. And having got this far, I really have to do it. And so I left the company to work for Dave full time in opposition. And that was from the beginning of 2006, I guess, through to the election, which was then in 2010. And that was an amazing time. And really, myself, Dave, George Osborne was a crucial part of it, and many others, I can't mention them all. But we really worked incredibly hard to get the Conservative Party in a position where it could win elections again. That was really the point. It went well. And then again, we had the same kind of process where he became prime minister, and we don't need to go into all the sort of ins and outs of how that happened, because it wasn't a clear majority. And so he made the decision very clear. It was an amazing moment of leadership, I remember, actually, after the election, where Dave had this incredibly clear sense that the right way through would be to go for a full coalition agreement with the Liberal Democrats rather than trying to muddle through in different ways. And that's exactly was the right judgment. And he called that right. All the rest of us were not clear about that. And he made it happen, and he became prime minister. And again, we had the same conversation. Okay, so what are you going to do? And I just remember having that first conversation, I think it was over the phone, the first weekend after he became prime minister. And I remember him saying, look, I don't know what we call the job, but I want you to make sure that we get things done and get done the things that we said we would do. That was the job. And that translated into the job title was senior advisor, which can be many things. But that really was my focus, was the implementation of our policy program, focusing on domestic policy. I wasn't really engaged particularly in foreign policy and defense and security and all that kind of stuff. It was really the core domestic issues like schools and healthcare and welfare and crime and economic stuff. Those were the areas that I really focused on.
What surprised you most about being in number 10? Because, of course, all of us have an idea. We watched Yes, Prime Minister, and she was satirised in the political comedy, The Thick of It, as the herbal tea drinking spin Dr. Stuart Pearson.
I have real tea here, by the way. I'm drinking in my Starbucks Halloween cup, but it's actually real tea.
So they didn't get it all right.
I'll tell you a story about, which I've said before, but it's very much central to your question, which is something that Tony Blair said to me. So I went to see Tony Blair a few months before the election. I sort of knew people in his world. We were good friends, actually, people like Tim Allen. And through that, we'd met Jonathan Powell, who'd been Tony Blair's chief of staff, and he gave us some good advice on how to organize things in number 10. And then I met Tony Blair, and he just said this thing to me that was so striking, which was that you've got to understand that when you get there, and he said, I'd realized this too late, that the civil service around you in number 10 and across Whitehall, the policy making top of the civil service, they really sincerely believe that it is their patriotic duty to stop you from doing what you want to do. They are the real guardians of the national interest, and they've got to protect the country from these here today, gone tomorrow politicians and their stupid advisors and whatever. And their job is to keep the ship of state going on the straight and narrow. And he said, it's not malicious, there's not ill intent, it's just that's how they think. And so you've got to understand that. I suppose I could say I shouldn't have been surprised because he said that to me directly in person. And I suppose that was the main thing that surprised me, which was how hard it is to get anything done, how complicated, not so complicated, of course we knew it was going to be complicated, but just the amount of bureaucracy and institutional barriers to making change happen were just really severe. In order to blast through them, you've got to have really aggressive political leadership. And I think Blair's point was that he didn't get to that point until too late to make all the change that he wanted to make. That was how he would put it.
And what was your proudest moment, would you say, during your time in government?
It's hard to say. There's so many different things, but there's one thing that I was very proud of being able to accomplish, because you could really see the through line from idea to implementation. And I don't know how well it's still going or not, whatever, but we started this thing called NCS, National Citizen Service. And the concept there, it actually was Dave and I were talking in the wake of the London bombings. And there was a lot of conversation about the security aspect of that, obviously the foreign policy aspect in terms of the Middle East and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and terrorism generally, but also the domestic angle, which was the fact that unlike 9/11, the London bombings were committed by people who were British, who grew up in the UK. And there was a lot of soul searching at the time. Like, how is that possible? How have we become such a fractured society that you have people who could literally be raised in England and this is what they do? And so there was a conversation about social cohesion. And we thought through conversations when he was, I think during the leadership campaign, so 2005, and we both, for a long time, thought about the benefits of something that we expressed as non-military national service. And people that did national service, they always say, well, it was a great thing because people from different backgrounds, we all came together, we got to know each other. It really put everyone on the same level. And so that was the idea, to create something like that without the military aspect, but that would bring everyone together. And so we started working on it, even in opposition. And I actually put together a whole process with all the youth groups and Prince's Trust and all the kind of experts who are outward bound, a whole bunch of people. It was a really thoughtful policy-making process that we began in opposition. And in fact, we actually got some donors to fund prototypes so that we really knew what we wanted this to be, because we'd actually done a few versions of it to test out what might work before we even were in the government, which is, I think, unheard of for an opposition to, as it were, spend money on that rather than billboards or whatever. So we arrived with an actual prototype, which really helped us get ahead of the curve in terms of making it happen. And so it got up and running pretty quickly. I don't know how many people went through it, but it was a really great, I just feel really proud of that as a very few things where you can point to it and say, yeah, that we took it from an idea to implementation in quite a short space of time.
Was it something that people opted in?
We actually entered the process with a expectation and assumption that it would be compulsory. And everyone who worked with you said, that's a really bad idea. That will make it seem bad, like school. You want to make it really attractive so people want to do it. So you achieve universality, which was our goal. Like, this is something everybody does, through making it attractive and desirable and aspirational. And so that's the way we approached it. But it's very complex logistically, because I don't remember what the numbers are now, but if I recall, the shorthand for it was school leaver programs. This is something you did at 16, and it combined an outward bound element and you go away. That was really crucial, the residential component, because that's when you achieve the social mixing. You can put people together from different parts of the country, different racial, social backgrounds, and so on. And so that makes it expensive and also logistically complicated, because you need space for lots of people. And in fact, roughly speaking, the cohort of each year was around 600,000, something like that. And so that's a lot of people. I don't think we ever got to that number, but that was the idea, that you did it at age 16 and it combined community service, outward bound and adventure. It's got some component of skills training and career preparation, all these different things. One of the people we worked with described it as a rite of passage, that transition into adulthood and thinking about your future. That was the idea. I left in 2012, so I don't know what happened beyond then. I think it's still going. I just don't know exactly what it is now.
Yes, you did leave in 2012 and you went to the West Coast to support your wife, Rachel Whetstone, who is another high flyer, and that was with her new job. And given you had built your network, you'd sunk your roots here in the UK, how difficult was it to transfer to the West Coast for you?
It didn't feel hard at all. Honestly, it really didn't. It felt like a really great new adventure. The thing that I guess made it easier was we had, unlike a lot of immigrants, we had a lot of resources and help. Rachel was at Google, and so there's a relocation service that happens. So that's made a lot easier for you compared to most people. And then I had thought about what I would do. And I think my friend Rohan said, why don't you do something at Stanford? Because that's right there where we live, near Palo Alto and Stanford University. And I thought, well, I'm not a very academic person. What would I do there? And then I remember he said, no, there's all sorts of things. And then I remembered that when we were in number 10, I'd done some work with the Obama White House on some kind of global government transparency project that we had launched. I think we were one of the 8, us and the US, and then India, Brazil, a few other countries. And we launched it at the United Nations General Assembly. And there was some kind of party afterwards, I remember. And I met this guy, Jeremy Weinstein, who was the deputy to Samantha Power, who was the national security advisor who'd led the process from the Obama administration side. And we were just chatting. And I remember him saying, oh, I'm going back to Stanford. He was leaving the administration. And wait, there was that guy from Stanford. So I literally just got his number and phoned him up. And burbled on about, well, we're moving to the area and I don't know what I want. And he said, yeah, don't worry. We have people like you the whole time. I'll take care of it. And he was amazing. He literally put together, I felt really embarrassed actually, because I didn't hear from him. He said, all I need is just give me some dates when you can be here and I'll set things up for you. So I gave him some dates and date was approaching and I hadn't heard from him. And so I sent this email gently nudging him. And I was so embarrassed. He said something like, hang on, it's coming. And then almost the next day, this incredible itinerary arrived, like literally like 2 days full of amazing meetings at Stanford that he had arranged with all the different parts of the university that he thought I might be interested in and who might be interested in me. So it was like a sort of matchmaking. It was completely brilliant. And that's how that all happened. So by the time we moved, I knew that I'd at least have something to do, that I wouldn't be sitting around thinking, what am I going to do here? And that's exciting. That's a whole new thing. And I'd never been in that kind of role at a university. And it was a range of different things. And so I was really excited about that.
Well, and then you went on to co-found and run CrowdPack, which is a political fundraising site and helps political outsiders raise money to enable them to run for office. And initially, it wasn't politically biased, but I think I'm right in saying that as you were moving towards the right, it was moving towards the left. And so you left. You have your show on Fox News, The Next Revolution with Steve Hilton. You have your podcast, The Steve Hilton Show, and that's an opinion show. Fox News has faced criticism for its alleged polemical output. Why do you think that nowadays the political debate is so full of venom when in the past it doesn't seem as if it was nearly as divisive?
Well, a couple of things. So first of all, I just want to say that you use a phrase that's sort of drawn to the right, whatever. And I don't think that's an accurate description. I think that I've been really consistent in what I think and what I've done about what I think for 30 years. And so remember, I worked for a Conservative Party leader and I was working for a Conservative Prime Minister in number 10 Downing Street. So I don't think it's that surprising that I would support the Republican Party in the US.
No, fair enough.
Of course, it's not identical. There are differences. And then the other thing I'd say is that the theme that I think has really been consistent in everything I've talked about and argued for and even done in my work, including CrowdPack actually, is this idea of putting power in people's hands, giving people power and agency over their lives in whatever form that takes, and decentralizing power. And I think that's both from a policy point of view, that's true, but I think actually emotionally that's true as well. I've just always been generally, I get very upset by arbitrary authority and people just bossing people around for no reason. And I think that is my worldview, that people should have power and control over their own lives. So to me, that is naturally a conservative, right of center, whatever word you want to use. That's the term for it, including the term that I coined for the theme of my show on Fox News, which was positive populism. During this period, you had a lot of people say, oh, look at Steve Hilton. He was David Cameron and Green and all this kind of stuff. And then he's supporting Trump and Fox News. And there may be a question you want to get to, but I want to address it head on, because to me, it's the same in the sense that what is the idea that animates Brexit, which I supported, and Trump now, and it's actually lifting up the working class who've been ignored and neglected and let down by decades, a consensus establishment view about how the world should operate and globalization and so on, which people who have power in that setup have done really well over the last 50 years. But actually working class people, remember going back to my roots as a Hungarian immigrants or whatever, I feel that group of society has been completely ignored by the people in power. And I actually only really formulated that clearly in a book that I wrote in 2015 after moving here called More Human, which I think captures my worldview better than anything else I've put out there. It's all about taking power away from bureaucracies and entrenched establishments and putting it in the hands of people. So I think that is the theme.
I read your book. I found it absolutely fascinating and it made huge sense.
Thank you. And so coming to the Fox News, I mean, first of all, I work for Fox News. I don't host the show anymore. I stopped doing that last year so that I could spend more time on California and traveling around the state and doing what I'm doing here, focusing on California and our policies and politics here. But I'm still a contributor with Fox News, and I'm on 5 or 6 times a week on other people's shows. And the thing that I would say, first of all, is that Fox News is very successful. It's by far the biggest and most successful of the cable news networks, and therefore gets a lot of attention on this point of polemicism. But actually, if you watch MSNBC, which is the Democrat alternative, as it were, by NBC News, it's actually far more partisan and propagandizing than Fox News is. So you watch Fox News during the day, if you take a 24-hour period of Fox News, I mean, the way that we always describe it, and it's true, is that it's a little bit like a newspaper, like an old-fashioned newspaper where you have the news pages and then you have the editorial, you have the comment pages. And that's how it's structured. So most of the day in Fox News, it's news, which is, yeah, you could say it has, I mean, I would say it's fair compared to the other news networks, and that makes it seem different. But it's fair, and you have Democrats on commenting and Democrat supporters on, as well as Republicans, during the daytime news hours. And then the evening, you have opinion shows, which are clearly separate. They're literally run by different divisions of the company. They have different people running them. And the opinion shows, as their name suggests, very opinionated. And my show was part of the opinions of primetime opinion section of Fox News. And so it's very clear, the distinction. If you watch the other channels, you don't have that distinction at all. You have your very, very strong Democrat propaganda, and in particular, I would say anti-Trump propaganda, MSNBC, the whole time. And they never have a Republican on to argue the case for Trump or for the Republican Party, ever. In fact, their version of balance is to have a Republican on who hates Trump. I think that if you watch Fox News, you will get a much better and more balanced view of all the issues than on any other of the channels. Now, in terms of the tone of the debate, I don't know, I'm not a historian of this, but I've read articles and commentary by people who really have studied it, say people were vicious about each other. Politicians were mean and vicious in the 19th century and accusing each other of all sorts of things. I'm not sure it is worse. I think it just seems worse, perhaps, because of media, the proliferation of media of all kinds, social media, of course, and particularly the smartphone. And that's the thing I feel incredibly strongly about, is like all the time we blame this app or that app, whatever. The real thing that I think has turbocharged all these negative trends in our society is actually the smartphone, because that's what makes it available to people 24 hours a day. And that's why I've never had one, by the way, because I think they're really dangerous and damaging to the fabric of our society. I don't think that social media is bad or any of these things are bad or have made politics worse. It's the fact that people are on their phones doing it all the time. That's what makes it toxic and dangerous. So I don't have a smartphone. I go on X and post a few things and look at half an hour in the morning, half an hour in the evening, something like that, because I have to go to my laptop to do it. And so I think that your point about the divisiveness of the debate, which is definitely true, and you saw it in Brexit in the UK for sure, and you've seen it here with Trump. There's something particular, I think, about, I don't know quite what it is, about those two things, Brexit in the UK, Trump in the US, that have really got people going. I wonder whether it's this, I mean, to me, it feels like a word that I use a lot is the people who were the guardians of the debate and the right thing to say and think, the groupthink, suddenly have had the peasants have revolted. And suddenly these people have got their view and had their way in a vote, in an election, in Brexit or Trump. And it's like, how impertinent. Who do these people think they are, challenging us with their peasant-like views? I think there's a lot of that patronizing, condescending tone to the debate where the people who had the power have lost the power and they don't like it.
One of the things that has characterized the post-Second World War order is international cooperation by Western governments. And given the rise of China, Russia, Iran, Korea, and their opposing belief systems, do you worry that if Trump were to get into power, with his apparent indifference to the Western institutions, would that undermine that Western cohesion just when it's most needed?
No, I think the exact opposite. I think it's been undermined with weak leadership in the White House for the last few years. So what's happened in the last few years since Trump left? You've seen, for the first time in anyone's memory, pretty much, the invasion of a European country. You've seen the Middle East explode. You've seen China become much more aggressive in the South China Sea, threatening other neighbors. That's all happened under Biden, not Trump. When Trump was president, you didn't have any of this. Why? Because he projected strength. And actually, the leaders of those countries that are contemplating causing mayhem in the world, whether that's Iran or China or Russia, all knew that they're dealing with someone who would not put up with it. And he told them that. Trump told me personally, the first meeting with Xi, I'm just telling you what he told me. I said to the interpreter, you translate every word of this. And he said to Xi, right, if you effing touch Taiwan, it's World War III. Beijing, gone. Forbidden City, gone. All of it, gone. Don't you dare. That's what he said to him. In comparison, where you have this weak leadership. And so you said, well, that's not how diplomacy is done. Okay, but it produced positive results. We had a more stable, less dangerous world. And also, if you look at Putin and Ukraine, so the same message to Putin. And by the way, who was it that actually stopped arming the Ukrainians? It was Obama when Biden was vice president. Who was it that started supplying weapons to Ukraine? Trump, when he was president, to defend themselves. Who was it that stopped the pipeline, put sanctions on the Putin pipeline, which was going to fuel his war machine with Germany? Trump put the sanctions on Nord Stream and told Angela Merkel, don't do this. You're crazy. Why are we spending our money through NATO, defending you theoretically from Russia, and you're doing deals with Russia to buy their oil and gas and these pipelines? And your former chancellor, Gerhard Schroeder, is on the board, the chairman of the board of Gazprom and Nord Stream. It's ridiculous. Trump pointed all that out. And Trump put sanctions on Nord Stream to stop the financing of Putin's war machine. And guess what? Biden gets in, lifts the sanctions on Nord Stream, and also lifts the sanctions on Iran. Iran didn't have the money to fund Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas when Trump was there, because he had the maximum pressure campaign. Couldn't sell their oil, didn't have any money. Biden lifts the sanctions, hundreds of millions of dollars flow to the Iranian regime, and then straight out the door to finance Hamas on October the 7th and Hezbollah and all of that. So it's literally the opposite of that view that Trump will cause mayhem in the world. It's the opposite. The strength that he projects and the clarity, the moral clarity against these hostile regimes is what actually kept the world stable and peaceful when he was president.
Daily Telegraph reported on Sunday, the 1st of September, that Mark Robinson has been endorsed by Trump as Republican candidate for governor of North Carolina. And Trump described him as Martin Luther King on steroids. Then Mark Robinson, his views are extreme, I would say. One of the more damaging being that abortion is, in his words, killing the child because you weren't responsible enough to keep your skirt down. So I read that and felt scared for women in the US. I just would love your opinion on that.
I don't know that candidate. I haven't followed that candidate. It's a big country, and you have lots of people running for office with really diverging views on all sorts of issues. So if you just pick any individual candidate, any individual race, you're going to find people on all sides who say crazy things. But I think on the broader issue, first of all, that's not something that this particular candidate would be able to do anything about, because the politics now of that issue, we had a Supreme Court ruling which sends it back to the states for their decision. And mostly that's going to be a combination of the state legislature and the governor. That's how it's worked. So at the state level, you've got that separation of powers, just like you do at the federal level. You have the president and you have Congress. And that's how laws are made. And so a governor acting alone can't do anything about that. Plus, you have the courts weighing in. So I don't think anyone needs to worry about one person's views being translated into policy in that way.
You're looking at running for governor of California in 2026. Why do you want to?
I am looking at it. I haven't made a decision. Look, I love California so much. It's interesting. Even before we moved here, there was an article I mentioned this a few times now when I'm talking to people, in The Spectator in the UK, and it was describing the policy strategy that we had. This is going before David Cameron became prime minister, like 2008, something like that. This article appeared. And it was describing the strategy and the policy ideas that I was part of the process for developing. The headline of the article was California Dreaming. And the theme of the article was that Steve Hilton, David Cameron's policy guy, blah, 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 wants to make Britain more like California. And there's a real kernel of truth to that, in the sense that I always found California really inspiring as the place that represented the best of everything that I always loved. innovation and dynamism and entrepreneurialism and opportunity and just the best of everything. And so I felt like I was in love with that ideal of California even before we moved here. And I feel that very strongly now. And it's the most beautiful place in the world. We have the most amazing weather. It's the best place in the world, as far as I'm concerned. Apologies to the UK, which I greatly love and appreciate all the years that I had there. But I think California is the best place in the world. And it's being ruined, actually ruined. We now have, I mean, I don't want to give a massive political speech about it, but the outcomes in California are a total disaster. We have the highest unemployment in the country, the lowest income growth, the highest rate of poverty. Look, we're the biggest state in America. And so we tend to have the most of this or the most of that. But it's not just the most people living in poverty. We have the highest rate of poverty, which is a scandal, as well as the highest taxes. We have the worst business climate, 10 years in a row, voted by chief executives. So on and on, we have the highest prices for gas and electricity and water and utilities, and you name it. The school results are a disaster. You go to certain school districts, you have 75% of kids not meeting basic standards. It's really bad. Obviously, the homelessness situation, we have the highest homelessness. We have 1/10 of the US population, but 1/3 of the homeless population. The housing, the California dream was always you come to California and you live the life, the good life. And you buy a house and you can have a nice garden and raise your family. That's all gone. We have the highest housing costs in America. Only 15% of Californians can afford the typical house price. I know housing is a big issue in the UK. It's a massive issue here. It's the number one reason people are leaving California, and they are leaving in droves. They're leaving this amazing place. So many people are leaving for the first time in our history since California became a state. We've lost representation in the US Congress, where they apportion districts based on population. We've actually lost representation. So something is badly going wrong. And I feel that after years of just talking about it, I don't want to just talk about it. I want to actually try and do something about it because I love this place so much. And I feel like the combination of things that I've done up till this point does put me in a position where I could do something about it. So that's what I'm looking at and seeing if there's any support and interest and whatever, because it's a combination of things. It's the right policies. It's the ability to turn things around politically, because it has been a very democratic state. But I don't think that's set in stone. I think it's possible. People are really sick. I mean, we haven't even mentioned crime. We've now become world famous. The scenes of looting and retail theft and all this kind of stuff, chaos. San Francisco, Los Angeles, amazing cities, just disfigured by this crime and homelessness and chaos and dystopian scenes on the streets. So people know that we need a change. And so the question is, can you put together a vision of how we make that change that overcomes the barrier of this people thinking, well, this is a democratic state and we don't vote for Republicans. I think that can change, especially when you look at the Latino population, which I think is really the key to the future of California. It's the largest population now group in California. We're 40% Latino, 35% white, 15% Asian, 5% black. It's a Latino state that's growing. 56% of the kids in public schools are Latinos. And if you look at what's going on politically in America, that is the biggest transformation in the last 50 years, which is this transformation of the Republican Party nationwide into a multiracial working class coalition. And that's happening slower in California than in other places. But if we can bring that about here, then we can change things and put California back on track. So that's why I want to do it. I mean, whether I will do it, we'll see. I've got a few more months to think about that. But I've loved the last year just traveling around, and we're the biggest agricultural producer in the world. We have the Central Valley, which produces 80% of the world's almonds and so on. Incredible. You've got Silicon Valley, you've got Hollywood, you've got San Diego, amazing life sciences. Like everything in the world is here, and the best of it, and amazing entrepreneurs and wonderful people and just epic landscapes and scenery. And it's just an amazing place. And it's a shame that it's been driven off to the extremes and in the wrong direction. So I think it's time we get things back on track. And that's what I'm looking at doing.
If you could just give us one example, having traveled around, that you would think, oh, I'd love to change that.
Well, it's a sort of area of policy, which is that, again, going back to what I was talking about in terms of the separation of powers. So for reasons that we don't have time to go into, the legislature is very lopsided. So roughly speaking, in California, if you look at statewide elections where you have people running for governor or lieutenant governor, or the positions that are elected across the state by everyone together, the Republican share of the vote in the last 20 years or so is pretty stable, around 40% or so. Average is 41.7%. But in the legislature, because of gerrymandering, all this other stuff, the representation of Republicans is not 40% or even 30%, it's 20%, really lopsided. which means that Democrats have a supermajority, which means it's very difficult to actually pass laws. But the executive branch, run by the governor, is responsible for all the agencies. And going back to what we were talking about in terms of the bureaucracy and my experiences trying to get things changed there, I've learned how they do things. And there's incredible plethora of bureaucratic agencies. If you talk to the farmers in the Central Valley, or house builders in Orange County, or tech people here, whoever you speak to, it's these agencies that are making their life a misery. CARB, the California Air Resources Board, the Water Resources Agency, the Coastal Commission, on and on. It's this incredible jungle of bureaucracy. And I think that actually is the way through this, because it's making it incredibly hard and expensive to get anything done here, to build anything, to do anything, to start a business, to grow a business. It's all just so difficult. And it's the agencies and the bureaucracy that make it so difficult. So that's the place to start.
You've written 3 books as well, and I read your More Human, Designing a World Where People Come First, and I particularly was fascinated by your education chapter. Last question. What advice would you give to a young Steve Hilton?
Well, I'm actually going to not repeat, but summarize some advice. Everyone can look at this. There's an amazing podcast episode featuring Megyn Kelly, who was a big Fox News star, and she's now got a fantastic podcast of her own. Anyway, she was asked a similar question. And I just thought her answer was perfect. So I'm going to basically say that, which is you just got to work unbelievably hard. Just whatever is thrown at you, you say, yes, thank you, fantastic. And I'll stay up all night. And I never leave before the boss goes. And I get here before the boss. And I look for things to do. And I'm always volunteering. It's like, give me more work, whatever I can do. Just hustle, hustle, hustle. That is absolutely the key to it. And I just think that accepting that things are going to be annoying and unfair and ridiculous and just frustrating, that is all part of being successful, especially when you're young and starting out. You've got to go for it 100% and work unbelievably hard all the time. And then I think you get the opportunities that will help you climb the ladder.
Great advice. You are so busy. I know I've kept you a long time. And unlike the rest of us who are happy to sit on the sidelines and just criticize politicians and whoever else, but you're prepared to throw yourself into that arena and give it your best shot. Thank you so much for talking to me. Good for you for running and throwing yourself into that arena, and good luck. Thanks so much, Steve.
Maybe.
And maybe throwing yourself. Well, you've kind of been in it.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Katie. Great to see you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B., Head of Marketing, to all of the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.